Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Nadine Haman. I'm a learning designer at SILT, and I am going to be presenting today mainly with my lovely colleague, Precious Kubeka, also from SILT. There we go. Precious, you quickly want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Precious and I am a learning designer at SILT. Yeah, that's all for now. Thank you. You can go on, Nadine.
Thanks, Precious. I almost stopped sharing now. So welcome everybody to the webinar, and today we are going to focus on something that I think most people think are quite simple, and sometimes when you get to the practice you find that it could come across as a little bit tricky. And what we want to do today is to show you how you can go about in crafting your learning objectives to be more inclusive. And we are going to do this at the hand of a framework that we are currently in the process of developing. There's a few people at SILT. It was born out of a reading project, but I'm quickly going to head into that as part of the presentation as well. Great. So thank you to those of you that have completed the expectations question when you registered for the webinar. We have this on the slides, and just quickly going through some of these. There are some people in the room supporting us as colleagues, and we say thank you to them. And we all know that we can never know enough. But then some of the interesting other ones, the first one on the slide there says that I want to learn how to create clearer learning outcomes and how this might help influence course design. There's a second one, how to reach my students better. Yes, we like that. Reflect on learning outcomes. This is quite an interesting one because it seems like there are some existing learning outcomes, and really to reflect on them, maybe think of how they have worked in the past. And what we want to encourage you today is to reflect and look at them from a more inclusive point of view. And then to improve learning outcomes, that could also be in various ways. To reach my students better, and to the first two that I read, I'm quickly going to address in a slide where I'm going to talk about the 6 questions that we can ask up front when we start developing our courses. If I can quickly just do a waterfall, if I can ask you, will you put in the chat for us just, are you an academic? Are you, in which capacity are you joining today? Just so that other people in the room also know, and not just us, so that we can just be able to know whom it is that we are talking to today. So, okay, thank you. You are welcome to post your answers when you are ready. So I see there is EdTech advisors. They are usually postgraduate students that assist with some course development work. Great. And there's even an emeritus professor with us. And just upfront in this webinar, want to say or use as a disclaimer, I don't think any of us in this room, I cannot speak for everybody, but in conversations that I've had with Cheryl and Precious, we just come to realize again that we don't know it all. And even if it's something as simple, seemingly simple as learning outcomes, there's still so much to learn. But we do think, and we do feel that there's really strong value if you can go and change your learning outcomes to become more inclusive in order to inform your practice, and how we can really make a difference in terms of the way that we approach in our strategies, the pedagogy that we use. I want to say all the way from the top to the bottom. So today, what we're going to focus on in this workshop, the first one is just to locate the concept of learning outcomes within the framework that we are developing. The second one is to clearly and confidently explain the value of inclusive learning outcomes to students. The third one is to accurately differentiate different levels of inclusive learning outcomes. The fourth one, explain what makes an outcome inclusive to colleagues. And then the fifth one, to exhibit persistence in crafting inclusive objectives suitable for a specific class. And maybe you are teaching more than one class this semester, but heading into the semester, I would want to encourage you, if you have any learning outcomes close by, to please open that up, look at them as we go through the webinar, and see where there are possible opportunities for you to bring something in, or to add different nuances, or to bring even new learning outcomes in. Okay, so it's time for a quick activity. We have prepared a WooClap for you, and Precious is going to paste the link for us in the chat. So I want to ask you all, if you can quickly head over to WooClap, please use the link in the chat. And then there is just one question, and it should provide you with 3 options. I'm quickly going to just give you some time. If you cannot access it, please will you let us know? Either
Is there an event code? I'm being asked for an event code.
Let's see. I need to stop sharing now. I think Precious is looking. I can see she's looking for one. Maybe if we...
There it is. YYRNK.
Yes. Yes. Okay, we are just giving people time to head over to the activity. Just for the sake of the recording, in the activity, we are asking one question. That is, what is your level of knowledge and or comfortability with learning outcomes? And there are 3 options. I have no knowledge of learning outcomes. The second option, I know what a learning outcome is, but would like to gain more confidence in writing them myself. Or I am quite comfortable with writing learning objectives. I'm interested in making them more inclusive or equitable. It seems like the majority of people today, well, that just changed. It seems like most people either know what a learning outcomes is, but would like to gain more confidence, or am quite comfortable with writing learning objectives and interested in making them more inclusive. Thank you so much. We wanted to ask you this because there are other resources available that we can share just in terms of improving your basic knowledge of learning outcomes and how to craft them. But as we said from the start, the focus of this webinar from our point of view is to focus on creating more inclusive learning outcomes. Thank you so much, Precious. Okay. So last year, there was a redesigning blended courses reading group that ran as part of a project that was that is currently led by Janet Small, and this project will draw to a close at the end of October. We were a group of people working together. There were still people, but also other people from other stakeholders in the university. And the main aim of this framework is to promote inclusive, digitally enabled learning for all. And so we created a 55-page document that will be living on the SILT webpage, but then followed the Enable framework. And the Enable framework's aim is to become and be an open educational repository that will live on SIL's website. We want to put practical tools in the hands of academic staff to be able to create more inclusive teaching practices. And today, one of those aspects that we're going to focus on is learning outcomes. Now, the Enable framework has several elements. The first element, outcomes. So this is basically at the conceptualization phase. So when you think through things such as your student profile, deliberated curriculum, which means like putting really long and careful consideration into what goes into your curriculum, make it more applicable to our context and the global south. And then also inclusive learning outcomes, that's what we focus on today, and expert learners. So these are the sub-elements of the outcome section. The other elements in this framework is outcomes, learning, teaching, assessment, evaluation. And then in the centrality or in the central part of the framework, we have materials and technology. And because we acknowledge that in all the other elements that there are an element of material and technology, and that's always present. So most of these other elements are still in development, but we did want to share with you the work that we have done so far, because we're really excited about the difference that we think this can make in people's practice. So there are 6 questions that you can ask yourself when you get started with your course design. And this is coming from an inclusive point of view, so adding diversity and thinking more to provide equitable opportunities for all students in your class. So ask yourself who will take your course. You would have remembered in one of the sub-elements in the Enable framework is the student profile. So create that student profile for yourself by either developing personas, and Tuesday there was a whole webinar on student profiles, and you are welcome to refer back to that one for more, I want to say, practical ways of getting this information. The second one is to ask yourself who is involved in the deliberation of the curriculum. Is it just the lecturer? Was it the person? Was it the group of people that sat down when they worked with the curriculum? Or do we create space for the students to actually be part and enter into these conversations? So I want to say the more engagement there is at this stage and very early on in the process, the more likely it is that your curriculum can be deliberated and your student voice can shine through. The third one is by the end, what do you want participants to know, do, reveal? And we're going to look at that through those 3 levels in today's webinar. So basically, you are creating learning outcomes. The fourth one, in which learning activities can your students participate to make this relevant or meaningful for their context? Not just the context that you refer to, but are you thinking through various scenarios, and they could consider that. The fifth one, what materials and technology can support this best? And I want to say, really thinking through people with disabilities here, but then also just there could be other hindrances in the digital space, for example, access. Number 6, how can your assessments help the participants achieve the learning outcomes? So making sure that there is alignment, constructive alignment between your activities, your assessments, and then your outcomes. Just a word up front. So sometimes people use objectives and outcomes interchangeably. And technically, there is a difference. And I'm quickly going to show you what the difference is, but we don't want you to get stuck in the terminology. So objectives are usually refer to the intentions of the lecturer. So that's the perspective. And then outcomes usually refer to the actual accomplishments of the student. And before I go down into those sub-bullets, so an easy way to think of this is an objective could signify what the destination is. So where is it that you want your students to go? And the outcome is then how have they actually arrived there? So I'm thinking through examples here. An objective could be by the end of the course, students will be able to introduce themselves, hold simple conversations, and understand basic and written quota, for example, if it's a language course. And if you go to the outcome then, Because remember, I said students will be able to, and now you could change that the outcomes is students demonstrate their proficiency in basic Xhosa by introducing themselves, having conversations, etc. And a bit later, we can think through ways of how do we make that more inclusive. So when we talk about outcomes and coming from the Enable framework, there are 3 different types of outcomes that we want you to be aware of. Traditionally, education is very much focused on the first one, which is indicated here as the disciplinary content knowledge. So that's your factual knowledge. What is it that I want my students to know? So very much cognitive, and I want to say a brain activity, almost so to speak. Then moving into the second type, that's practical disciplinary specific skills that they can demonstrate. So that's in traditional with the Bloom's taxonomy, the psychomotor skills. This is what should students be able to do. So the first one is know, the second one is do. And in here we can distinguish 2 levels. You can have the disciplinary specific things. So I'm thinking, for example, if you are teaching your MBCHB course, a practical skill would be for a student to know exactly how to use the scalpel, to create an incision. And that's very discipline specific. But then you could also have more generic skills. And these are the outlying skills like your digital literacy, for example. Do they know how to use the computer? And these are things that we usually try to also support in other ways from a university point of view. The third level here, not the third level, I beg your pardon, the third type is the meta level characteristics. And this is usually where you ask yourself, what is it that my students need to feel? So this indicates dispositions of students, their positive attitudes, or even the graduate attributes that UCT is referring to, and students need to reveal this. Now, just up front, we can also say that when you have all the outcomes in your course, this is usually the one that gets left behind because it's extremely difficult to measure this. How do you measure feelings? How do you measure a disposition, for example? So people tend to shy away from them or to just put them in a parking lot somewhere. But we really want to encourage people to move this up front and put this and engage in conversations with your with your students, when you go through the outcomes that you have created for your course, to say to them, hey, but what can we add here? And, while doing so, having them and bringing students into the curriculum, it's also part of the exercise to deliberate your curriculum in a certain sense. And you can do that on a more granular level. It doesn't always have to be just on the very high level, because the small changes that you make with every iteration of your course accumulates over time. And you would be surprised at the different direction. I mean, if you can take a ship and just have 1 degree difference, over quite a few kilometers, 1 degree difference is going to make a massive difference. Okay, so particular emphasis was placed on learning outcomes by the student-centered movement. So this is how and this is also how the Enable framework. We keep on asking ourselves as we are developing the Enable framework, and Enable stands for enabling accessible blended learning for equity. And what we feel is very different is that we try to bring the student front of mind the whole time. It's like, how does the student fit into this? It takes quite a lot of effort, but it really becomes a practice. It's like the more you do this, the more conversations you have with this, the easier it becomes, the more ingrained. I want to say almost like we're building muscle memory to a certain extent. Okay, so I'm very happy. I just wanted to say one thing for learning outcomes to make a learning outcome more inclusive. I read the other day that don't follow the 3 Musketeers approach. And the 3 Musketeers approach is 1 for all and all for one. And that's what we're saying. No, not all for one and 1 for all. We need to make sure that one outcome needs to be written in such a way that, that it includes everybody, and that we doesn't have, we try to box people in what we want them to do, but allow people to be in the space, be themselves in the space, and organically, also be able to to grow into the learning outcome that you have set before them. Precious, I'm happy to hand over to you.
Thank you, Nadine. Hello once again, colleagues. So what is a learning outcome? We can describe it as a brief statement of what the students will be able to know, to do, or to reveal by the end of a program, a course, a module, or even a session. And it also states to what degree should the students be able to know what you want them to know, and to what degree do you want them to be able to reveal or to do. And also it states under what conditions. Now, these three things can refer to the first one. The first statement can refer to the what, that would be the action verb in your outcome. And the second one can refer to the how, and that would be the subject, the content, the disposition, or even the skill. And the last one, under what conditions, can refer to the context that you want the students to be able to function under or in with that skill or whatever that they have acquired. And in the next slide, I'm going to take you through the why learning outcomes are the most powerful tools in the processes of teaching and learning, or even the practice of teaching and learning. First, they frame and give purpose to teaching and learning, and they help focus the attention of the students and that of the educator, and they shape the learning activities and the assessment choices that we make, and they also help us with our critical reflection of both the process and the achievements of the students. So it is through learning outcomes that we are able to reflect on what we have done and how we have done it, or also what the students have achieved. There are different levels of learning outcomes or levels of abstractions when it comes to learning outcomes. Now, the reason we are giving you this is because you may be at a level where you are creating those outcomes. So we want to make sure that you are covered in each and every level. So the first level is the program level outcome, which is also known as the exit level outcome. These outcomes are the ones that we expect students to have or be able to do after they graduate from a specific course. And then under each program, there are courses, and then those courses would have their own level outcomes. Under each course, there may be modules, module 1, module 2, module 3, up to module 5 maybe, and those modules will also have their own learning outcomes. Then after those modules, there are sessions or sections of the work that you need to do, maybe on a weekly basis. Those sessions also will have learning outcomes. Now, all of these learning outcomes build up to the program level outcomes. They are not standalone. You do not start new learning outcomes once you get to the section or the weekly learning outcomes. They all build up from the program level outcomes, because once students, whatever students do on a weekly basis, should cover what the module outcome levels expect of them in that level, and the module level outcome should also cover or respond to the course level outcomes, then finally the program level outcomes. Now, where would you be able, or where or how would you be communicating these levels of outcomes in accordance to their spaces or their levels? Now, if you are working with program level outcomes, you would want to communicate those in the proposal stage of the process of the program development. When you are creating course level outcomes, you'd communicate this in the faculty handbook, in the course outline, in the digital learning platform. In our case, that may be Amatuba. And if you are designing course module level outcomes, you'd communicate this or present this to students in your course outline, in your digital learning platform, and in your course notes. And in the sections, the sessions, or the weekly tasks that you might have, or presentations, you would communicate your learning outcomes in a digital learning platform, in a course notes, and in your presentations as well. And that would be it. Now, where would you start? All in all, we should be able to start. Now that you know this is where I am, this is the level where I need to start off or create my outcomes based on. Are you creating program level outcomes? Are you creating course level outcomes? Are you creating module level outcomes? Or you simply need to create the session level outcomes? all of these are still responding to where should I start. With each of them, you need to start by answering these few questions before you can start. What level of complexity are the cognitive outcomes? So this speaks to whether you want students to remember, whether you want them to understand, to apply, to analyze, to evaluate, to create, to engage, or to contribute. The second thing you might want to ask yourself is what type of skill set should the students be able to develop? These can be generic or they can be disciplinary specific. Now, some of the skills you may say, I want students to be able to communicate. I want them to have the skills of presentation. I want them to have analytical skills. I want them to have this type of skills. So you also look at the type of skills that you want them to develop. And lastly, what ways of being should the students be? Now, the ways of being speaks to their values and their attitudes. And what graduate attributes am I looking for? This can speak to their ability to critically think, problem solving, and the last one, the soft skills that students should be able to enhance when they are doing this. The soft skills, maybe you want them to be able to self-motivate once they are done with whatever level of outcome that you are presenting. Now, the principles that guide our craft in designing inclusive and equitable learning outcomes specifies what exactly we should look out for when we are crafting learning outcomes that are inclusive and that are equitable. These are very important because they answer the question of, I know how to write learning outcomes, but I need to know how to write learning outcomes that are inclusive and equitable. Now, these answers that question. These principles tells us that the first thing that we need to think about is that we need to separate out the learning and the assessment activities from the core outline. By this, why are we even emphasizing this one? Why are we saying this needs to be separated? Because another person would think, why would I want to separate what the student will have to do in order to demonstrate that they have acquired the skill? When we are separating this two, we are allowing our learning outcome to be inclusive and to accommodate all types of students, no matter their context or whether or not they are in a condition or in a space that requires them to do something differently from the other or to operate differently from the other student. So in this one, we made this example to say, so that students with various temporary or permanent impairments can meet the outcomes in a variety of ways. So no matter the condition that a student is reading the outcome from or the space from which they are receiving the outcome, they should be able to have an equal, if I can put it like that, or an inclusive way of also being able to have a chance of meeting the outcome. The second principle is that we need to separate the technology and the tool or even the resources from the core outcomes. And this speaks to the types of resources that we expect students to show off their skills in or to show off what they have learned, their knowledge on. Now, this one, I would like to emphasize it also with specifying the fact that sometimes we tend to give students tasks that are based on the type of tool that we as lecturers are comfortable with. For example, I'd say to student, write an essay in a Word document simply because I know it's easier for me to work or to mark on a Word document. But when we separate the technology or the tool, we allow students to explore different types of tools or technology aspects that they can use in order for them to show off their skills. So once we separate these things, we are not simply saying students are supposed to go wild in this thing, but we are giving them that opportunity to say, explore, use what you are most comfortable with, not what I as the lecturer or as the facilitator of the course is comfortable with. The last principle is that we need to make effective dispositions and attributes of it. E.g., if we want to say that students should be able to do something, sometimes it's very important that we be clear about how we want them to do it. If you say, I want my students to be able to communicate, how? If you say, I want my students to be able to communicate confidently, then that means you are putting in effective dispositions and attributes. You can say, I want them to think. And secondly, you can say, I want them to think critically. So that's you putting some emphasis or something that separates that just the ability to do to the ability to doing it in a certain way. And in the next, we are going to look at different examples of how to craft or to frame learning outcomes that allows for optimal flexibility and ensures that students can demonstrate the achievement of relevant knowledge, skills, and the ways of being. So these two examples are just giving you a picture of the principles that we talked about and the questions that you need to ask yourselves before you start crafting learning outcomes. The first one says students will be able to clearly communicate their ideas about climate change in writing and submit on a Microsoft Word document. Then the second one says students will be able to confidently communicate their ideas about climate change clearly and persuasively to an informed layperson. Now, the first one, when we look at it, the fact that it says they need to be able to communicate in writing, it already limits their ability, or it limits their minds to simply their communication modes to simply writing. So there are no other methods of communication that are required from them except that of writing. We have been specific enough to an extent that we ended up limiting students instead. The second one, it talks about the Microsoft Word document, and this is maybe a technology, a tool, or a resource that you might have or want to use. And in this format, it also limits the students to saying they need to use this very one specific tool. This, sometimes we can think, okay, it limits them because I, as the lecturer, I'm comfortable with it. But we also need to look at it from the perspective of saying, are all my students having access to this tool that I want them to specifically respond in, or to specifically show off their skills? Because sometimes that is how we'll think students are unable to communicate their ideas while they are not able to have access to the tool that we have specified instead. And the last thing is that we did not clarify the level in the first learning outcome. So there's no point, there is no context from which we want students to be able to communicate their ideas. Let's see the second one. The second one, first of all, we are still on the first slide. Thank you. The second outcome says that students should be able to communicate. How so? Confidently. And in their communication, they should be able to persuade. Those are effective dispositions and they are clearly specified. The second thing I want you to see is that the communication mode is not specified. We are not telling students that their communication method should be writing or should be verbal. Why? Because we want students to be able to select that. We are giving them that opportunity to explore how their communication level, which level their communication levels could reach. And the last thing is that we give students a clear audience. We are giving them a context to say, where should this be able to happen? And that will also inform the communication mode that they select. So now that we've given students an informed layperson, by looking at that person or at their audience, students may be able to select a communication mode that is applicable to their audience. So in the first one, we did not specify the level. Therefore, students also have a limited method of communicating. That means there are a lot of things that we have closed off, and as a result, the learning outcome is not inclusive and it does not accommodate all of our students. And that is all from my side. For now, Nadine, I think you can continue with the next slide.
Thank you so much, Precious. And in the process with students, if we create these learning outcomes and as students, I want to say almost grow in the process and in the process of reaching these outcomes. One of the outcomes that we have not a learning outcome, but one of the endpoints that we want to achieve with the Enable framework also is for students to become expert learners. And what does that mean? We want to encourage learners to develop skills and strategies to self-regulate their own learning. So meaning that they need to take charge of the process, and that the role of the lecturer here is becoming much more of a supported, or to support them in the process. So one of the ways that we can do this is, as Precious pointed out, is to provide multiple ways for students to access information, and also how they demonstrate their understanding or to apply the skills. In the case of the Microsoft document, it could now be a different, it doesn't have to be limited. And in this way also to encourage students to stay motivated more, by allowing students to gauge what works best for them, and which helps them to become experts in their own learning. So as they become expert learners, we should view this rather more of a process than an endpoint. And students can become more strategic and goal-orientated if you can allow them to formulate plans for their own learning. So we set the goal for them, we provide the learning outcome, but then they have to figure out, so to speak, how to get to the endpoint. And that's also a very important part of the learning process. And that is what will enhance their skills to become expert learners. So they need to devise strategies and tactics to optimize their own learning. They should be able to formulate plans. They should need to learn how to communicate about this. If they're not sure of something, ask that to the lecturer, for example, or the academic staff. And in the process, they become more resourceful and knowledgeable in the area, because there's a lot of emergent outcomes that's also reached. For example, accidental learning that takes place in the process. So ways in which lectures can assist students to become more expert learners is, first of all, to have clear learning outcomes so that the students know where they need to go. That's the first part. So, and another way to do this is to take these outcomes to your students and have open conversations at the start of the semester, or whatever the time frame is. But at the start of the course, take your course outline with the course outcomes and ask them, how can we make this more inclusive? And by doing so, you are already also partially deliberating your curriculum. Then also help them to engage in active learning strategies. And how we can do that is by either intentionally building that into our course, or by encouraging them to participate in group work. For example, you could provide case studies to them. If you have some problem-based learning, I know many of the complaints of problem-based learning or project-based learning is that the lecturer said they start feeling like a project manager. But don't do that for your students. You need to give that back to the students, because that's also how they engage in the active learning strategy and become an expert learner. Then also providing constructive feedback. So we all know, or we should know, the importance of how imperative it is for a student to get that constructive feedback, not just a well done, but the areas of growth, pointing that out. But another strategy that you could also use is to ask the students to self-assess their work, and then you look at their self-assessment and at that opinion, because that already provides a space for critical thinking that you give to the student, which is then more a disposition also that you want to encourage. That's the third type of learning outcome. Then the next one on the slide is encourage reflection. So help them to think back. How is it that you have learned? Not just what have you learned, and how do you think you will be able to apply this going forward, or maybe even in different contexts. And then the last one is to foster a growth mindset. It's imperative for us to foster this growth mindset and to really provide spaces for this. For students to really cultivate persistence, dedication. I'm thinking, we have a 3-year-old daughter, and sometimes she would just say, "Mommy, I can't," when you know for a fact she can. She will be able to. And then not just saying, "Yeah, okay, to save time, I'm going to do it for you." No, saying, "You can do this," talk them through the steps, etc., but really building that confidence, and I want to say inspiring the students in the process. Support them. I want to say almost be their safety net in a sense. I think that brings us to the end of our presentation. We are going to send an email to all the participants where we will provide a link to the slides, so all of you will receive the slides. Currently on screen, I also have a resource linked where it says restructuring blended courses. So this is one of the elements of the Enable framework that we are working on, and the inclusive learning outcomes, which helps you. It's just basically a written document of many of the things that we have talked through today. So I'm very happy to open the floor now for discussion time. If you have any questions, please, or comments, conversation, the floor is yours.
A very good presentation. I first have to comment. Now, I just have a question. When I'm giving the students an option to select the tools they can use in terms of expressing themselves, do you give them a list to select from, or you just tell them to use whatever tool they can find or they're comfortable with?
I suppose that would be discipline specific, that will determine that answer. In the example that Precious have used, maybe the limiting factor could be a word processing. Then it could be Microsoft Word, it could be, I'm thinking of Google Docs. So I think it depends on the nature of the task. So I think if you want very specific outcomes, then you could have a list maybe to choose them, because already you are providing options within that. So I think it's context dependent. So I don't know if that brings you closer to an answer, Joseph.
Yeah, that does. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Michelle?
Thank you for a great presentation. Yeah, I've been looking at learning outcomes for a while. I did the diploma in health professional education last year, and we worked a lot on this. But one thing I still get back from our students is time, the lack of time on their part. You know, we design all these great things, what we think is great in our heads, looks great on paper, with these teaching strategies and tasks and things, and they still get back to, they actually like to sit there for 45 minutes and just get you to kind of spoon feed them, then have to, you know, do all these great techniques that we're learning, because they just say they don't have time, you know. And I look at their curriculum and I look at their day, and I actually agree that their time is just so short. They go from lecture to lecture or whatever. In our, I'm talking health sciences faculty specifically, and they're really busy. I just, yeah, I don't know if you have any great ideas on how we try and help them, but not spoon feed them enough to get the time limited down to where it is manageable to engage with teaching.
Precious, you want to go? You want me to go?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for you, Michelle, unfortunately. But I would say, how about we use this as an opportunity to ask them, how do they think they can overcome the no time type of a thing in order for them to be able to excel and still be able to cover what they need to cover. I do understand what you are saying. As I was presenting, I was also thinking about time. How do you bring forth all of these nicer ideas and still be able to manage time? And I was afraid maybe the time aspect would come from the side of us as lecturers, but I'm glad that you're making it come from the side of students as well, because if it's from their side, then it's something, it demotivates sometimes when you have to create all the nicer things. I really do understand. Hi, Benedicta, I think you also have something to add.
Oh, I don't think I see Benedict.
Maybe that was a...
No, I think Benedict's his camera and his mic is not yet activated. While we try to sort that out, Michelle, just maybe an add-on thought is I would think that really trying to encourage the student to become expert learners in the process, as Precious pointed out, and asking them. But is it a case of they don't have enough time, or do they leave it too late and then they don't have time? Because if you devise strategies from the start where you plan and you say that this is the curriculum and I need to build like almost, I know students that literally tackle these things like a project, right? And you break it into the smallest steps and you have certain intervals at which you need to reach certain deadlines. And I want to say that some curriculums are much more packed than others. And in that sense, you know, that students can literally take the agency of their own learning to say, but I need to do this. And then if they really, really can't keep up, maybe there's like if this comes up too often. So as a lecturer, if you think that it's doable, I mean, if it's not doable, then we need to go and change something in the way that we teach. Cheryl, I don't know if you have any insights here, maybe.
Yes, well, thanks for asking. Shall I think this is a challenge, and building on what both Precious and Nadine have said, I think the key thing is the coherence of the curriculum and the coherence of the tasks and assessment activities that you're asking for, so that if they are asked to do specific things, that they can see how these individual little tasks build up to something substantial. Because I think young children are curious and they learn little different pieces and they don't really care how it fits in. Our students have moved into the adult learning environment now, and adults are very strategic. So they will learn if they see how it benefits them. And one of the benefits is that all these little bits add up to like a cohesive assessment at the end. The other thing just to bear in mind is that if we are doing the talking all the time, we are doing the learning, because students think that they are learning when they're sitting there. But in fact, the learning only really happens is when they actually do it themselves. So it's almost like a false sense of competence that they have. And I think we've got to be upfront about that. So it's not a case of making them do everything, but making them do things that are strategic along the way and that hopefully link up into a cohesive project or essay or assignment or portfolio or whatever it is, something that is a coherent whole, that they have built up the pieces and they can see why they're doing it. Thanks.
Thank you, yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. I think it's also gets back to the communication between all the conveners within a program, to all sort of have the end game in sight together and not work individually, which seems to occur sometimes. Thank you for your help there.
You're welcome. Thank you. Benedict, you had your hand up?
Yes, but I think my point has already been addressed. I was just going to link the time with the learner being at the center, that if we design with the learner being the expert, I think even that could sort of limit the time constraints, because they know how far they could reach. But it has been covered. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedict.
Nadine, if I could add one more comment, but this is probably not going to go down well. But in order to look at timing, one of the best pieces of advice I had before I became a teacher, not just a lecturer, was to do my own assignments myself. And it gives you a very good sense of how much time you need to read this, go and read that blog, read this article, watch this video, and then come together and write an essay. If you try and do what you're telling them to do, it's a jolly good wake-up call and keeps us honest.
That's good advice, Cheryl. Michelle?
Thank you, Cheryl. Yes, I absolutely agree with that, because when I did this diploma, you know, between all sorts of other work and stuff, there I was, you know, preaching to the students, no, don't leave it to the last minute, don't leave it to the last minute, always work up front. And I had to look at myself and laugh, because there I was sort of 15 minutes before the hand-in time, still trying to proofread my thing. So I have a huge empathy for my students suddenly. And when they ask for those extensions, I go, yes, of course, I understand all the dilemmas. So yes, I agree with you. I think if every lecturer could do an assignment or two within the time frame that they have, I think it just gives us a lot more understanding, I think, of what we're expecting.
And I think that just naturally brings in, Michelle, I can hear the humanizing element that has come in, the empathy that's also much more prevalent.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Michelle.
No, I was just agreeing with Nadine. I think it's about they need to see you as a human being and not as this sort of person that's just there to teach them. I think they understand a whole lot if you actually, explain this to them as well. Like, I completely understand. I've been through this. I think they just really realize that you're actually just a person as well, just like them.
Yeah. Another quick little piece of advice that might help, and that is if you're expecting them to use a specific tool, and it's new to them, then it's almost like you really need to provide some help in a tutorial or in some extra kind of support outside the class. Because sometimes students are taking so much time to learn to use the tool that it's taking up the time in terms of how quickly they can do the task. So they're not focusing on the content, it's focusing on the tool. So if you get them to use a tool they're already familiar with, then they can be quicker. But at the same time, I'm not saying don't use new tools, but I am saying if you are, specifically if it's something that's going to be really useful for a particular discipline. So for example, in business, you want them to use project management tools, then it will be slower the first time. And you've got to actually build that into the time so that, because they're going to take time to learn the tool as well as what they're writing in the tool. Thanks, Nadine.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm just thinking, that's in the second type of it's what students need to be able to do in the more generic skills, but then the more exposure they get, I want to say the stronger the neural pathways will become, right? So it's also like with practice. So considering that first encounter with a new tool or a new strategy is definitely takes longer.
And perhaps my final point to connect back there is partly we don't know what the students know. So last 2 days ago, we had a session looking at pre-course questionnaires where you ask students opinions about what they know. So that's not their actual competence, but it is a sense of what they know and don't know. And it can be quite helpful for you to get a sense of that before you start the course. If you are requiring specific tools to be used. And I mean, even in terms of the content that they have a little bit of an idea about. So just as an example, one of the questions asked in a pre-course survey information science was around what is their knowledge about Python or HTML. And we had put in an option that said, I have no idea what this is. And what was interesting in how we use this information, we fed it back to the students as well as to the lecturers, is to show them, like there were like 70% of the students had no idea what this was. So it gives you an idea of how you need to teach, but it also normalizes for them the anxiety they might have. Like, I'm the only one who doesn't know what this is. In the meantime, 70% of the class has no idea what this is. Thanks, Nadine.
Thank you. I just also had a thought as you were talking, Cheryl, coming back to the types of outcomes. The question, the effective outcomes, like some of the graduate attributes and the dispositions. And we had this conversation in preparation for the webinars. Also, like, one of the things that you want, for example, a disposition of accounting students would be honesty, for example, right? When you go into corporate, you want students to be honest, but how are you going to measure this? I mean, there's all this talk of AI and I know, and plagiarism detectors and all of this because of dishonesty, right? If you want to go that route, there are many, but I'm just thinking that how do you test this? Is it because we can't measure it, we shouldn't have it there? Or is it that we can have these conversations in class and we can really encourage these ways of beings, without us being able to test them and allow students to really think through this, reflect on this and practice it in practice. And so I think from my side, that would be just a parting thought. I see we are at time. Thank you so much for everybody for joining this webinar. A special thanks goes out to Precious, my co-presenter today. It was lovely to present with you. And Cheryl Hodgkinson Williams is an emeritus professor at UCT, and she has been a huge part of the preparation for this webinar. So we thank you so much, Cheryl, also for your input, and we love learning from and with you. And I wish all of you a lovely day. And thank you. Thank you also for the thanks in the comments.
And then just the last thing, Nadine, is that we did offer, if people wanted to send up to 3 outcomes that you're working with, you can send them to me if you would like some feedback on how to make them more inclusive, because it's sometimes helpful to have another pair of eyes to help. So you don't have to, it's just an offer.
Yes. And I want to say, don't feel like you need to get it right, before sending it through. It's like really an opportunity to get feedback. So strongly encourage you to do so. Okay, so as we said, we will be sending the slides through. So you can just keep an eye on your emails, and I wish you all the best for the rest of this Thursday afternoon. Take care, everybody.